Thank you. So, in the last class, we basically studied the behavior of firm and the market in the long run as well, correct? And ultimately, we ended up establishing the properties of an industry that behaves like this as the properties of perfect competition, right? Perfect competition. What did we say about perfect competition? What is a perfect competition? Did we have a list of characteristics or attributes that an industry has to possess to be considered perfectly competitive?
Yes.
What was that list? What were the items on that list?
Free entry.
Free entry and exit. Let's stop there. Do you think it's important for an industry to allow for free entry and exit of firms?
Yes.
For the industry to actually end up in a long-run equilibrium? Why is it important? Because without free entry and exit, firms cannot enter and exit and supply will not shift, right? And you will not have the transition to the long-run equilibrium, correct? That's why it's important. Now you might say, okay, excited, free entry and exit. Is there anything but free and entry and exit? Are there any industries where entry is not free? Can you think of an industry where you would like to enter, but you can't? Look, is there big bucks to be made in pharmaceutical industry? Yes or no?
Yes.
Or pharmaceutical industry
Yes.
companies, rich companies? Absolutely. So why don't you guys start your own company and start producing Lipitor? Right? 100 million people are on Lipitor. Insurance companies pay top dollar for it. You could be gazillionaire.
It's not that easy.
What do you mean it's not? What's not easy? Take a few chem classes, take some chemistry, set up a little lab at home, start making little homemade Lipitor.
It has to be approved by the FDA.
Oh. In other words, what's actually keeping you from doing that? It's not just laziness or lack of chemistry skills or something, yes?
The government.
First of all, you would have to probably comply with some regulation. And ultimately, even if you meet the government's regulation, you're still not going to be producing and distributing Lipitor. Why? Who's going to stop you? Even if you satisfy all the government regulation.
The company that owns the copyright for
The company that owns, what's the word?
copyright.
Might be copyright, but it's patent, right? Exactly, patent. The company that owns the patent on it. In other words, the company that actually developed the molecule, Lipitor, right? They patented it. Why did they patent it?
To be sure no one steal it.
To make sure there will be no entry of other firms, right? To keep other firms out of that industry. Why do you think pharmaceutical companies care to patent their drugs to keep competitors out? Because it allows them to keep making huge profits in a long run, right? They don't have to worry about rising competition because everybody's going to start making Lipitor, right? So you see, you said that the first attribute that defines an industry, perfectly competitive industry, is free entry and exit. If you don't have free entry and exit, if products that are produced by this industry are patented, it's not going to be a perfect competition. That make sense? Is large one-topping pizza patented?
No.
Can you actually go open yourself a pizza place and start baking large one-topping pizza just like everybody else in this
Yes.
town makes? There you go. That's pretty much free entry, right? And exit. If you decide it's not for you, you have better opportunities somewhere else. Are you free to simply wait out your lease, fold the business and move on to something better?
Yeah.
Absolutely. What is the next attribute defining perfect competition? I can't hear you.
Many firms.
A lot of firms, right? Why does it take a lot of firms for this to happen? For the industry to converge towards that long-run equilibrium?
would still have no idea.
Say it again?
I would still have no.
Okay, but we'll get there. Let's first take care of the simpler ones. Any other attributes we mentioned?
Homogeneous product.
Homogeneous product. What did we mean by homogeneous product?
Same.
Same.
Everybody's making basically the same thing. Sorry. Everybody's making basically the same thing. You can't really tell product from different producers apart from one another, right? Why is that important, guys? Okay, we'll get there. Any other attribute we mentioned?
You said it equals no market.
Okay. So the bottom line is, why does it take many firms to make industry perfectly competitive? Why does it take a homogeneous product to have perfect competition? And the answer is in a relatively inconspicuous detail that I kept mentioning over and over again, as if it was something obvious and always true, but it's far from that. Why is price equal to marginal revenue? Why is marginal revenue equal to price? Again, what is marginal revenue? What is marginal revenue? In English, what is marginal revenue?
The money you get from making singles.
One more unit, exactly, right? The money you get from selling one more unit. Well, if you're baking pizza, you're selling it for $10. How much are you gonna get for one more pizza? $10, right? In other words, when you bake one more pizza, you will sell it for $10. How does the price of pizza change in Jacksonville when you bake one more pizza?
It doesn't.
Oh. How does the price of pizza change in Jacksonville when you bake one less pizza?
Nobody cares.
How much does the price of pizza change in Jacksonville if you bake no pizzas today in your business?
No.
It doesn't. In other words, what impact on market price of pizza in Jacksonville do you have within your own little
No
business?
power, zero.
Absolutely no control over market price. We call that no market power, right? It means your firm has no market power. And because you have no market power,
Nobody cares.
you are baking and selling first pizza for $10, second pizza for $10, third pizza for $10, and so on, right? In other words, because you have no market power, your total revenue looks like that. In other words, that no market power condition, no market power requirement defines the shape of the total revenue function. That's why total revenue looks the way it does. And because total revenue looks that way, marginal revenue is simply equal to price. In other words, thanks to the fact that you have no market power, that you have perfect competition, price determines marginal revenue and average revenue, and the picture looks this way. And thanks to that, of course, the firms and industries in the long run end up in efficient long-run equilibrium. That makes sense? So, basically, instead of simply memorizing the list of those requirements that make an industry a perfectly competitive industry, we can simply say, look, industry is perfectly competitive as long as there is no market power, okay? As long as no firm can change price, no matter what they do, price in the entire industry. And then we can actually reverse engineer that list, and we can ask, what does it take for an industry to be an industry where no firm has the market power? Well, if there's one big company in that industry, do you think that one big company that serves everybody could have power to change price?
Yes.
Oh, so how do you want to take that but that power away from the company. You make that industry full of small companies, right? In other words, you have a lot of companies. So why did we put that requirement, many firms, on that list? Because it helps take market power away from everybody, right? Why did we require that firms make homogeneous product?
So that not a single product has a higher quality, which would allow you to sell it.
Or is distinguishable from anybody else? Exactly. Because even if my, even if my pizza tastes exactly the same like everybody else's pizza, and it's made from same ingredients and it's as big as everybody else's pizza, but I make mine with a purple hue. And everybody, oh, that's cool, I have to have me a purple pizza. And then I tell you, okay, you're going to have a purple pizza, you're going to pay $11, not 10, right? That gives me market power. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So, in order to take that power away from producers, we have to make sure that we're talking about an industry where there is homogeneous product. You can't tell product of one firm from the product of another firm, right? Can anyone in this class tell Domino's Pizza apart from Pizza Hut pizza? You can. You've eaten enough of those, right? Very good. So you see, you might say, pizza industry in Jacksonville is not exactly perfectly competitive. Well, and you might be right. It may not be perfectly competitive. We may find deviation from these requirements, right? Can you think of an industry where product is really homogeneous? How many corn farmers do we have in America? Tens of thousands of farmers. Which farmer's corn do you like best? Bill's corn or Joe's corn? Both. Makes no difference, right? I mean, as long as it's a certain quality of corn, it doesn't matter who grew it, you buy it, right? So, there are examples of markets where product is pretty much homogeneous. And of course, in that case, firms have no market power. That makes sense? Has anyone read about that story when, you know who Warren Buffett is, right?
Yeah.
Warren Buffett, the great stock picker and
Or the Fox.
capital allocator and so on, right? A brilliant guy. He understands how the world works. And one of his sons, when he was growing up, one of his sons wanted to become a farmer. That was just his dream. And was consulting with his father, what do you think, Dan? And I said, well, if you love it, you do what you want, but how do you want to make, how do you want to make a career out of it? And I said, what do you mean? I love, the smell of earth and tending to those plants, and it's beautiful. Okay, but to turn it into a successful career, to turn it into actual steady source of good enough income, you have to distinguish yourself. How are you going to distinguish your corn from everybody else, if that's your thing, growing corn? How is your corn going to be different from everybody else?
Change the color.
Why do you think anyone would care how you change, how you distinguish your corn from everybody else? Because if you manage to distinguish your product from everybody else's, you are gaining market power, and you can turn that market power into positive economic profit, right? And you can do better. If you don't have market power, if your product is just like what everybody else is doing, then you're gonna be facing stiff competition. That make sense? Very good. So all those conditions we mentioned for perfect competition simply serve one purpose, and that is to enumerate the properties or attributes of perfect competition, stating that the firm has no market power and therefore ends up in a long run efficient equilibrium. That makes sense? That brings us to the next question. Are all firms in America efficient? Or, by extension, are all firms in America perfectly competitive? Are all industries in America perfectly competitive? For example, when Steve Jobs first introduced iPad in 2009, how stiff was the competition in the tablet market?
It wasn't.
There was no competition. He was the only one. Was Apple in the tablet market at that time a perfect competitor?
Monopoly.
There was no competitor. It was a
Monopoly.
monopoly. Did Apple have market power
Yes.
in that tablet market? Could Apple decide to sell that Apple at any price they wanted to?
Yeah.
Now, of course, if I tell you, could they sell that iPad for $5,000?
Yeah.
You would say, well, sure, there's nothing illegal about it, but would they do it?
Yeah.
Some people would say nobody would buy it. Well, think about it. Imagine a really cool iPad that nobody has. There's just a few pieces selling for $5,000. Do you think a few people could actually buy it?
Yes.
I'm sure they would sell a few dozen, possibly a few hundred of those tablets around the world, right? So they absolutely could have done it. On the other hand, back in 2009, could they actually start selling those iPads for $300? They absolutely could have. And can you imagine how many of them they would sell back then at $300? Exorbitant millions. Instead, the price of those iPads in the very beginning was how much? How much were they selling it for? $500-600, something like that? Something like that, right? In other words, much less than $1,500 or $5,000, considerably more than $300. How do you think they ended up with a price like that? How did they pick a price $500-600? It's not cheap, it's not super expensive. What job does that price do better than any other price?
Maximum profit.
Exactly. In other words, that firm, a monopoly, can set the price. It has the power that a perfectly competitive firm does not have. Monopoly can set the price and can set the price in a way that maximizes the profit. Exactly. That make sense?
Yeah.
Very good. So now we're going to turn our attention away from perfect competition and start studying behavior of a different firm, behavior of a monopolistic firm. That makes sense? Let me erase this. Let me keep that and work here. So now we're going to talk about monopoly. Now, monopoly, again, is a firm that's trying to maximize the profit. And the profit, again, is the difference between total revenue and total cost, right? And of course, the monopoly chooses a quantity at which that profit is going to be maximized. I'm going to call the monopoly output QM, monopoly quantity. Now you probably immediately notice I'm using capital Q. Why am I using capital Q?
Because the one firm is like the whole market.
Because one firm serves the whole market, so the firm's output is actually the market output. Exactly. The firm chooses the market output. Precisely. Okay? And again, to understand the monopoly behavior, we have to understand monopoly's cost and monopoly's total revenue. What do you think properties of the cost structure of the monopoly are? And by now, guys, I know you're tired, but your instinct should immediately kick in. There is only one correct answer to every cost question. What do you think determines the monopoly's cost properties? The law of diminishing diminishing marginal product. In other words, monopoly's cost, derived cost function, looks like this. Marginal cost, average total cost. Okay? Can you tell the difference between the cost of the monopoly and the cost of the perfectly competitive firm? If you can't tell the difference, it's because there is fundamentally no difference. This may be a big firm, this may be a small firm, but the fundamental properties are the same because they're determined by the law of diminishing marginal product. So the cost looks pretty much the same. Now, how about the revenue? Now that the cost is taken care of, let's focus on the revenue of the monopoly. Does the camera capture
Yeah.
this part of it? Very good. So the question is, what are the properties of the monopoly's revenue? First of all, we said the monopoly serves the entire market, right? So let's suppose this is the market for the product of the monopoly. This is the market for iPads. In that market, there is us, the consumers, represented by our demand curve, okay? Suppose we use our good old demand curve that we've been relying on, price equals 10 minus Q. So it's a demand curve with vertical intercept 10, horizontal intercept 10, right? Now, the monopoly is going to serve this market. There is a consumer willing to pay up to $10, and there's consumers willing to pay less, and depending on how high the price is, consumers choose to purchase certain quantity demanded, correct? So that's the demand. Now the question is, how can we find monopoly's total revenue using that demand? Well, let's think about it. First of all, for every quantity, there is a certain price, corresponding price along the demand curve, right? Quantity 0, quantity 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now, what price would the monopolist have to set to sell absolutely no iPads? Price would have to be 10. And what price would the monopolist sell one unit? 9. 2 units? 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay? Those are combinations of prices and quantities the monopolist can choose to produce. Monopolists can do in this market whatever that firm chooses. But of course that choice will determine the monopolist's total revenue. What is the monopolist's total revenue? Well, if you produce nothing, how much total revenue are you going to generate? How much? 0. What's going to be your total revenue when you sell one unit for $9? $9. What's going to be your total revenue when you sell 2 units, each for 8? 16. Next. 21. 24. 25. 24. 21, 16, 9, and 0. Total revenue of the monopoly. How does total revenue of the monopoly compare to total revenue of a perfectly competitive firm? Well, remember, under perfect competition, if you sell no pizza, what is your total revenue? 0. When you sell one pizza for $10, what is your total revenue? $10. 2 pizzas, $10 each? 20. 3 pizzas? 30. In other words, total revenue of a perfectly competitive firm is a rising straight line, right? That's total revenue of a perfectly competitive firm. How about a monopoly? Well, let's graph it. Quantity, total revenue. Quantity, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What is the total revenue at quantity 0? 0. At quantity 1, total revenue is
9.
9. At quantity 2,
16.
16. At quantity 3,
21.
21. Quantity 4, 24. At quantity 5, how much? 25. And then again, at 6, 24, 7, 21, 16, 9, 0. When we connect those dots, what do we get? Something looking like an upside down parabola, right? This is total revenue of the monopoly. Does the total revenue of the monopoly look like the total revenue of a perfectly competitive firm?
No.
It's completely different. Cost structure of the monopoly can look just like cost structure of a perfectly competitive firm. But the revenue structure is vastly different, right? Okay. So let's now find out what derived revenue functions look like average revenue. How do you find average revenue? So per pizza revenue, per unit revenue, right? When you generate the revenue 0 by producing 0 units, what's your average revenue? We're not evaluating at 0, right? When you generate revenue $9, when you produce 1 unit, what is your per unit revenue? 9 divided by 1. 16 divided by 2 is 8. 21 divided by 3 is 7. 24 divided by 4, 6. 25 divided by 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. What did we find out about the average revenue of the monopoly?
Equals the price.
It's the same as the price at every quantity. What tells you the price at every quantity? The demand curve. So what can you tell about the average revenue? Average revenue is the same as the demand curve, right? What was the average revenue of a perfectly competitive firm. Do you remember what average and marginal revenue of perfectly competitive firm looked like? It was just equal to price. Average and marginal revenue of a perfectly competitive firm was just equal to price. Average revenue of the monopoly is given by the market demand curve. Looks different, right? It's not the same thing. Okay, how about the last derived function, marginal revenue? What is the marginal revenue gonna look like? First of all, let's recall, what is marginal revenue? What is marginal revenue?
Revenue of additional.
Revenue from selling additional units, right? So look, when you're making nothing, your revenue is 0. When you start making the first unit, your revenue goes up from 0 to 9. How much does your revenue increase when you produce the first unit?
9.
By $9. Your marginal revenue of first unit is $9. What is the marginal revenue of producing the second unit? When you increase production from 1 to 2, your revenue goes up from 9 to 16. What's the marginal revenue? $7. Marginal revenue of the third unit? 5. Fifth unit? Fourth unit? 3. Fifth unit?
1.
Sixth unit?
1.
When you start producing sixth unit, your revenue falls from 25 to 24. What's the marginal revenue?
-1.
-1. Seventh unit?
-3.
-3. Eighth?
-5.
-7. -9. Okay? That's bizarre. Let's try and graph marginal revenue in this diagram. It shows us that marginal revenue when I'm producing 1 unit is 9. 1 unit is 9. 2 units, 7. 3 units, 5. 4 units, 3. 5 units, 1. 6 units, -1. In other words, when I connect these dots, what do I get?
Downsloping.
Downward sloping marginal revenue of the monopoly. Wow. That's bizarre. So how does a monopoly actually choose the profit maximizing quantity? Well, when this is monopolies, average revenue, which is the demand curve, and I'll show you in the next class. I don't have time for it now, but in the next class I tell you that in general, marginal revenue is simply a curve that tends to start on the vertical axis where the demand starts and has twice the slope with linear demand. And you combine that average revenue and marginal revenue with marginal cost and average total cost, you can ask a question. What is the monopoly output that maximizes the profit? And we know the answer is it's the output at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Can you find the quantity the monopolist chooses to produce? Can you find the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost? Marginal revenue, marginal cost. At which quantity is marginal revenue equal to marginal cost? Can you see that? That's where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. That's the monopoly output. Well, if the monopolist chooses to produce this quantity, how much is the monopolist going to charge you? Because monopolist has the market power. Monopolist can charge any price it chooses to. What price do you think monopolist chooses to charge when it wants to sell this quantity? Let me give you a hint. If you're a monopolist in this market, what is the highest price you get away with if you want to sell that much? How about this? Is that correct? Look at that price. Buyers are willing and able to buy precisely that quantity, right? So that's the monopoly price. Is this monopolist making any profit?
Oh, yeah.
Look, if you're selling at that price and the average unit costs you that much to produce, how much profit do you make? This much profit on average unit times the number of units gives you the monopoly profit. Correct? There you go. My question is, does the monopoly produce efficiently? Does the monopoly produce at the lowest point along the average total cost curve? Not necessarily. Now, if this is a monopoly because they have a patent, they're making positive economic profit. How fast can firms enter and compete that profit away? They cannot. So the monopolist will keep producing huge monopoly profit for a long time while producing its output inefficiently. See, there's no competition. Inherently, monopolies are inefficient. Does it make sense? Thank you very much. I'll see you on Thursday.